Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us to talk about how enterprises are rethinking their IT strategies because of digital sovereignty. My name is Rahiel Nasir, and I'm an Associate Research Director with IDC's European Research Cloud team. So increasing cloud adoption, as we know, is raising concerns about data security and privacy. And in research that we have recently conducted with VMware, we found that more than half of organizations in Europe currently store data that they classify as either top secret or confidential in public cloud. Now, these are very sensitive data that would have serious or even catastrophic consequences for business if they were leaked. Now, as you can see here, I've got a lot to get through in 20 minutes, so let's get straight into it. Now, data sovereignty remains a big priority for organizations today. And when we asked about their biggest security compliance or trust challenges in cloud, as you can see there, 23% are concerned about data sovereignty. Now, that's a slight rise from the 22% who answered a similar question in IDC's European multi-cloud survey last year. But note that many of the concerns that you see there, so for example, identity and access management, managing encryption keys across multiple cloud environments, in my opinion, all of those play into this overall digital sovereignty narrative. Now, IDC considers data sovereignty and cloud sovereignty to be subsets of an overall concept of digital sovereignty, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But when asked about what their top attributes were when looking for a cloud partner, you can see that 21% of European organizations look for digital sovereignty capabilities. Now, it's going to be no surprise to see countries like Germany and France there in the top 5, but look at this, right at the top, we've got Czech Republic, and here in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. These are relatively new, emerging and upcoming cloud markets where there's growing cloud activity. And as we've already said, as all things cloud are now, top of mind for many organizations, so are issues of security and sovereignty. And you can also see that the 21% are from the following industries. So the government sector ranks among the top here, but not by a huge margin, which may come as a surprise, that there isn't a bigger gap between government and other sectors. Now, I think this is a question of maturity. Our latest research tells us that only 29% of public sector organizations say they're using cloud extensively, and that's below other sectors, other vertical sectors, where at least 37% say that their use is extensive. Now, added to this, 22% of public sector organizations currently prefer to run things on-premise exclusively. However, when it comes to cloud planning or evaluating cloud use, 27% rank data sovereignty as a high priority when seeking partners. So what's all this telling us? Well, I think what it's telling us is that the public sector organizations here in this sector are still largely at the beginning of their cloud journeys. And as their cloud usage grows, so will interest in the need for sovereign solutions. And then we expect to see the gap widening. Now, the Russia-Ukraine war has, of course, heightened concerns over the last few months. And that's quite a busy skyline. But if I could draw your attention to the two figures right at on the right-hand side. So when combined, we've got about 75% of organizations across Europe now consider digital sovereignty to be more important, and they're either adjusting their operations or changing their IT strategies as a result. And what's more, while digital sovereignty has so far mainly been of interest in regulated industries such as the financial sector, note how other sectors like manufacturing and retail in the middle there, they're also beginning to take note. So what are these industries actually doing as a result? Well, there are the options scrolling on the left. And when we did ask that question, most business and IT leaders said that they're improving privacy measures and implementation, and also improving supply chain management and transparency. Both of those rank at 31% apiece. Now, supply chain issues, of course, you'll remember, were already highlighted during the pandemic. And organizations now want to get on top of all this, and they also want to know the source of their IT services and goods to ensure greater resilience, because, and mark my words here, at the end of the day, digital sovereignty is about greater business resilience. Now, some of the other top responses you see here include how organizations want to work more closely with their ICT suppliers to mitigate third-party risk. And that total there was 29%. And notably, if you look a little bit further down, just one up from the bottom, we have 26% are going to review their current service level agreements and force majeure clauses in IT contracts. And that wasn't an issue before the conflict that we're seeing in Europe. And that particular response, you'll be interested to hear, is highest in public sector, followed by manufacturing, utilities, oil and gas, and construction. Now, IDC has found that 80% of organizations in Europe consider digital sovereignty to be their highest priority over the coming years, and that ranks alongside diversity and inclusion. So how do you go about it all? Well, we've come up with a decision flowchart to help organizations deploy sovereign solutions, and it all begins here with customer organizations asking themselves whether they consider digital sovereignty to be a strategic priority. Now, the answer here, of course, could be no, but then they need to consider if sovereignty is mandated by state legislation or regulations. And if it is, then you begin that digital sovereignty journey. Or the answer still could be no here, and then you have to ask yourself, well, is sovereignty needed to gain access to an ecosystem of partners? And we heard about ecosystems and partners earlier on. Still no? Well, in that case, if sovereignty isn't even important to your customers or brands, then I'd ask, why on earth are you listening to this presentation? Now, for those who have already decided upon sovereignty solutions, there are two crucial first steps. First is to carry out a review of what you'll need for sovereignty, and then classify your data, because not all workloads are bound for a cloud or indeed a sovereign cloud. By the way, you could do those, either way around, but those are the first two steps that you're likely to take. And then you're away. You're going to use regulatory and legal frameworks to stay on the right side of the data protection officers, and it should all be supported by dedicated APIs. Now, sovereignty solutions are, by their very nature, restrictive. So you've also got to make sure you keep everything in balance so as not to stifle innovation. And then, of course, the final part is to maintain security and compliance on an ongoing basis. And crucially, this must be a shared responsibility between all providers. Now, we've heard it so many times already, but sovereignty success is based on working within an ecosystem. So despite what the look of this slide might tell you, it's not a game of Monopoly where winner takes all. Now, if you look at many of the steps here, the other thing I'd like to point out, if you're looking at things like reviewing security, classifying data and apps according to workloads, maintaining security on an ongoing process, they're really all part of best practice and due diligence. And those processes should have been on the IT agenda, well, for decades really, right from the outset. So really, there should be no surprises here. And of course, we all know the potential consequences of not following best practices in the IT world. Okay, so now the evolution of existing data privacy laws, as my predecessor was talking about, together with new forthcoming rules and regulations, means that DPOs, CISOs, etc. have their work cut out for them, as the onus is going to be on them to ensure that organizations remain compliant, or else fear the severe penalties that we just touched upon in the previous slide. So trying to stay on top of this is, of course, the top challenge that we see here. But I also want to talk about the ability to move data easily and safely, from one provider to another, because that is also an important tenet of data sovereignty. And as you'll see towards the bottom of the graph, 27% in Europe say they're hampered by the lack of solutions that offer such portability regarding data sovereignty needs, while the ease of data mobility is also an issue for 25% of organizations. And linked to this also is the issue of vendor lock-in, and you can see that in the middle, if you can make out the blue there, for 31%. So if user organizations are tied to a particular provider, it's going to likely to prove difficult for them to move the right workload to the right venue, which in the case of data that is subject to regulation and compliance is going to require a sovereign approach. So organizations should not face any restrictions here. Now, if we turn to the challenges of implementing a cloud solution, well, the top answer for almost half of all organizations comes as no surprise. It's high complexity. But if you look at all those challenges here, this is pretty serious stuff and indicates a significant lack of maturity when it comes to organizations looking to deploy sovereign solutions and a sovereign strategy. And despite being at the bottom of the chart where you see lack of know-how, that is still a concern for almost a third of organizations. And the other thing to note, I think allied to that, if you look a little bit further up, in the light blue, fourth from the top, lack of skills. A lack of skills to integrate those sovereign solutions into existing cloud environments. And I mentioned the importance of skills previously, but if we look at this more closely, when asked about what they consider to be the main skills needed to manage sovereign cloud, the top answer here is defining the scope of a sovereign cloud strategy to win additional budgets within the organization. Time and again, there is much evidence in all this that suggests that market education is vital at this stage. I think customers need greater clarity around what digital sovereignty is and how data sovereignty, cloud sovereignty, etc., all fits in. Now, apart from data sovereignty, which is more clearly defined because of legislation, generally, there are no standard benchmarks and definitions when it comes to this idea of digital sovereignty. Or, we have terms such as trusted cloud as well, which I think actually add further confusion. So customers are going to seek external support for many of the skills that they need, and they're going to turn to their partners and providers for solutions here. Now, in a broader context, I think we all know when it comes to skills, we all know there's already a skills shortage within IT, not just in Europe, but globally. So all that, I think, is just going to exacerbate matters. Now, what you see here is how digital sovereignty priorities are going to affect the use of different cloud partners for organizations. And instantly, it's revealed that when it comes to SaaS, IaaS, and PaaS, most organizations in Europe plan to move more workloads to local cloud providers, with only a fifth or under saying that they're going to shift these to global cloud providers. Now, should that be of concern to those major cloud providers? Well, I think what remains to be seen is how robust the local response is going to be when it comes to the speed, the scale, and the innovative capabilities of the so-called hyperscalers, as well as how quickly, embodied by that tanker that is the EU, can move in all this, especially when it comes to edge, which I think is going to be the next battleground for cloud supremacy in Europe. Now, for those organizations who plan to shift workloads based on digital sovereignty, when you look at the totals as seen on the far right here, you can see that the top three types of workloads affected are security, data management, and storage. But if we just go and look at the verticals along the top, there are varying responses according to industry sectors. So, for instance, the public sector, which is the first set of columns you see there on the graph, for the public sector, the top workload affected are back-end business apps. For financial services, it's storage, while for manufacturing, utilities, oil and gas, and construction, it's backup and recovery. So as I touched upon this before, some of this also, I think, illustrates where organizations are on their cloud journeys. So this kind of almost can help serve as an indicator of cloud maturity. For instance, if you take app development, you can see that this ranks as a greater priority in financial services. So I'd say that's an activity that's indicative of a more mature cloud user. But you look at that priority in the public sector, and you can see that it's not as high as it is in the public sector, as it is in financial, because those users are still in the early days of their cloud migration. Now, throughout this presentation, I have talked about digital sovereignty, and we have a very specific view on what this is and how it differs from data sovereignty and cloud sovereignty. So, data sovereignty, as we all know, focuses on all aspects of data privacy and controls, but digital sovereignty is about more than just data. Besides cloud platforms, it also includes workload software, data center assets, and communications infrastructure. So digital sovereignty, I think, focuses on the control over data, infrastructure, and software that are created upon and relied upon to operate in the digital world. Now, I said this before, that data sovereignty and cloud sovereignty are subsets of digital sovereignty. Indeed, there are many other aspects to consider. We believe the whole idea of digital sovereignty is beginning to evolve due to global events such as the pandemic and ongoing geopolitical uncertainties such as the war in Ukraine. And with that evolution, we see digital sovereignty shifting gears. And I think some of my other fellow speakers have touched upon this. It's beginning to encompass several layers that start with self-determination and move up to self-sufficiency and even survivability. And our advice to organizations who are ready to embrace this broader view of digital sovereignty is that they should be aware of the following when designing, procuring, and implementing and managing software. So, for example, if we talk about the self-determination levels, it all begins with the data layer. Now, the evolution of EU data regulation that started with GDPR is now being extended to things like the Data Governance Act. And as a result, enterprises in Europe should look for technology solutions that provide a holistic view of how data are collected, classified, processed, and stored to ensure that data legislation and regulations are met. So if you move up a layer, now we talk about technical sovereignty. Now here, organizations, as we said before, cannot afford to lock themselves into custom-built solutions that become legacy systems in their own right. And they must aim to work with platform players that can deliver plug-and-play capabilities. And just to reiterate, this should also include open-source solutions that lend themselves well to interoperability, portability, and transferability. So if we move up the stack, we now come on to operational sovereignty. Now, IT executives, according to our research, want to work with technology suppliers that offer cloud capability that enable transparency in controlling operations. And that goes from provisioning and performance management to monitoring of physical and digital access to the infrastructure. And finally, for this section, assurance sovereignty. Now, this is mainly about the resilience that I was talking about. And it's being mandated by rules in Europe, such as the EU Cybersecurity Network and Information Systems Directive and DORA, which defines the principles to ensure that European digital infrastructure is always available to provide critical services in the banking sector. So self-sufficiency, so supply chain sovereignty, so my predecessor touched upon this as well. So as well as reinforcing digital supply chain resilience, the aim here is to strengthen the competitiveness of Europe's digital economy and its capacity to innovate and ability to create jobs. Now, all of this is becoming more important, as I said, in the light of major events such as the pandemic and the ongoing conflict. And you'll also see here that skills is a part of this. And we've already discussed the challenges here, but in the context of this sovereignty layer, organizations, I think, should expect their cloud suppliers to invest in knowledge transfer, as this can support and foster local talent and empower companies to develop their own digital innovations. And I think that without this transfer, that much talked about skills deficit in Europe is going to continue to perpetuate. So right at the top of the stack, we go on to survivability and geopolitical sovereignty. So here we're beginning to see IT executives in Europe wanting to use cloud solutions to help deal with the strategic weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and high-risk dependencies of an increasingly volatile geopolitical environment. And added to this, policymakers in the EU want to build on the open and competitive single market to enable Europe to become a more assertive player in fair and rules-based international trade. Now, all of the attributes that you see in what we call our sovereignty stack are mutually dependent on one another. For instance, the easier and more affordable it is to integrate solutions and switch among vendors, the easier the opportunity to promote co-innovation with local companies that create local jobs and hopefully expand the digital economy. So as we try and sort of wrap up some of this, our advice for sovereign solution customers and providers, and beginning with customers, our advice to customers is to start with the process of data discovery and classification. Now, this is foundational to any data governance, privacy, and security program. And the process, I think, helps to build an understanding of what types of data are held, how it flows through the organization, and what the most suitable venues are for each workload and app. And then IT executives, we believe, should look for cloud solutions that ensure protection against cyber attacks and black swan events that could negatively impact the continuity of critical services. And failure to do so, especially for organizations in regulated sectors, could result not only in the hefty fines that we talked about earlier on, but also reputational damage and loss of trust. Now, we've already said that adding sovereign cloud options in multi-cloud and hybrid IT scenarios means further complexities and potential extra costs for organizations. And I think the additional investments needed here are going to cover areas such as local infrastructure and platforms, new tools for data governance and management, and redesigning internal processes and mechanisms to ensure compliance, and of course, new skills to support all of that. The other thing I think it's worth touching upon is that while there are advantages to using cloud solutions hosted by in-country providers and partners, this can reduce the ability to realize public cloud's full benefits. So as well as hampering scalability, it could also mean restricted service in terms of being able to leverage any energy-efficient data centers and best-in-class cybersecurity. The other good benchmark, I think, for organizations looking to deploy a sovereignty solution is to use the jurisdiction, the jurisdiction that has the toughest regulations as that benchmark when they're evaluating the use of the solutions across their international operations. Now, this is going to ensure higher levels of assurance and uniformity across the organization's business locations and help mitigate any regulatory challenges. And of course, they must also always be aware of new and upcoming legislation. Now, finally, I think for this bit, customers are going to seek out partners and providers that offer the greatest adaptability and flexibility when it comes to sovereign offerings. And that also, a reminder, includes open source solutions. For providers, I think sovereignty compliance requirements mean that vendors are going to fall under greater customer and auditor scrutiny. Vendors need to be prepared to field customer and partner questions on the availability of compliance-enabling features for regulated workloads. Market education, I think, still remains completely very vital at this stage. Solution providers often have different and differing approaches to meeting their customers' sovereignty needs, and they should ensure that buyers don't see a trusted cloud and a sovereign cloud as one and the same thing. Now, while sovereignty concerns are on the agenda for public cloud customers, they only form a small part of the mix that vendors need to offer. So, for example, sovereign cloud providers will need to demonstrate capabilities around digital trust, identity and access management, regulatory compliance, governance, and much more if they're to be seen as the go-to provider for customers needing sovereign solutions. And then, of course, we already said that it is vital to mention security and compliance on an ongoing basis. And crucially, this must be a shared responsibility across all partners. So here are some recommendations to finish off with. So cloud sovereignty is still in its evolutionary stages, and where users are only just beginning to understand the implications it's going to have on their cloud strategies. And while the need for sovereign solutions is largely going to be driven by data privacy laws and regulatory needs and continued uncertainties regarding future legislation, all organizations should ultimately be guided by business outcomes when considering any kind of cloud. And here, including digital sovereignty and planning, will make inevitable future adjustments easier. Implementing sovereignty principles is a long-term process. It involves adapting to new IT requirements in terms of infrastructure, strategy, governance, framework, and skills. So all of these are likely to become key criteria for sovereign cloud selection. IT decision makers need to understand that by over-optimizing for local needs, they risk lock-in with local providers. And while sovereign cloud providers who are bringing SaaS on-premise may be preferred to larger providers who may offer SaaS on-premise or in the region, they can be restricted due to residency and jurisdictions. So for the providers, we would say that to meet customers' critical data sovereignty needs and preferences, vendors should consider certain baseline controls, such as the availability of data location controls and in-country data centers, so that customers can choose where to locate their sensitive workloads. So we see a few of those baseline controls here. Now, as we move towards the end, so digital sovereignty, I think, should be presented as something that helps organizations become more resilient. And remember that sovereignty success is based on working within an ecosystem of partners. This notion of an ideal sovereign cloud, I think, is one that exists in a vacuum, where you're isolated and protected from all potential data breaches. And you need to really verbalize how that differs from a practical, real-world sovereign cloud. So that's it from me. If you want to find out more about digital sovereignty from IDC, this is a section of reports that we've already published, and we've also launched a new research channel on digital sovereignty in Europe where you can find out more. So many thanks for listening.